Yeah, we did 2 whole pages yesterday. So the Mishnah that starts in Ayin Beis, Amin Aleph goes on to Mishnah Ayin Beis Amin Beis, had a machlokus between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. The question was, in particular, if you have a fetus that sticks its arm out, and then you slaughter the mother, is that arm considered to be a nevela or is it a treifa? Now, what's the difference between a nevela and treifa? A nevela is you can't eat, and it's also tummy. Treifa you can't eat, but is not tummy, not contaminated, anything. And so there's a discussion between them. What the logic is? What exactly they're arguing about? Why would one opinion say it's tameh, and the other opinion would say it's tahor? Well, not necessarily tahor. Said it's tameh as a treifa. Yeah, we had asked. I think one of the last things we did yesterday. What makes a treifa tameh? Treifa is not tameh. So when it comes to sacrifices, a treifa is tameh. At least in this case, it would be tameh. So in sacrificial meat, then it would be tameh as a treifa. But if it's not sacrificial meat, then it's tahor as a treifa would be. And Rameir says it's a nevela, and therefore it is tameh. So then we had a question. We quoted a brisa that described the argument, and the argument sounded like it was missing some steps. And the Gemara said, "Yeah, we're missing some steps." And then the Gemara, the part we got up to, says we found a brisa that puts all that has the entire argument with all the steps. So that, the brisa we had was missing steps. We have a Tani Nami Hachi, which is a brisa that goes through the whole step-by-step discussion without missing any steps. And that's what we got up to yesterday. Tani Nami Hachi, which is the second to last wide line on the page. I don't know which note it would be there, but you know which note number?
16 was the note number.
Okay.
That's 16, which is actually about this second. It was actually
second line before it gets wide. Yeah, second before it gets wide. I mean, yeah, second to last narrow line. Okay, that's what I meant. I just said it completely wrong. Okay. Tani Nami Hachi. It also taught in a brisa similar to the way the description discussion we had already. Amalhan Rameir says to the rabbis, what made this limb not a nevela? Because remember, this baby was not slaughtered. The mother was slaughtered. The baby is only considered to be slaughtered as much as part of the mother. This limb is outside the mother. So Rameir is saying, what would make this limb be considered to be slaughtered? It's not part of the mother anymore. It's sticking out. From being a nevela. Amrullah, they said back to him, no, shkita's imo. The slaughtering of the mother purifies it from being nevela. It says, if you say Rameir says back, you say it's because it's slaughtering the mother. Imkain, if so, it's considered to be slaughtered because it's part of the mother. Tatiana Bechila should prevent it with eating. Meaning, if it's part of the mother, it's considered slaughtered. Once it's been slaughtered, then you can eat it. Amrullah said back, no, treifa tochiach. There's a case of treifa that proves you wrong. They slaughter it, and it stops being a nevela. It does not allow it to be eaten. So you don't just because it's been slaughtered, it doesn't prove anything that you could eat it. That's considered to be part of the mother in the sense that it's slaughtered, but still left its boundary, so it's a treifa. Amr Lehen said back to them. This is very Meir talking again. Tiara Shchita. So then, im tira shchita, if shchita can purify in a normal case treifa of a treifa, that's osa that's purifying the animal. That's aver meduldoba, and even I'll agree with you. A related case, we're going to talk more about this shortly. There's a related case if you have an animal that has a limb which is hanging on by a thread. So when someone slaughters an animal, if there's a limb hanging on by a thread, that limb may not be eaten. That limb is considered to not be part of the animal, in the sense to permit it for eating, at least according to some opinions. We'll see, it gets a little complicated later. But the basic idea, if it's not attached to the animal entirely, it's just hanging on by a thread, then when slaughtering it, the slaughtering does not permit this limb to be eaten, but nevertheless the limb will not be an avela, it will be a treifa. So Rabbi Meir says back, I understand in this case of a limb that even though a limb is not permitted to eat, but it's not a nevela because it's part of the animal you're slaughtering, because it's part of the body. I understand that slaughtering the animal makes all parts of its body, and this is still somewhat part of its body, so the slaughtering it removes the tumah from that case. I understand that.
Even if it's a slight attachment?
Yeah. It's enough that it's considered not a nevela. It's not going to make it permitted to eat, but it makes it not a nevela. So that I understand. Right, because it's part of the body. Titar, should it purify as a uber, the fetus, she'ena gufa is not part of the mother's body. So how can you say that what makes you say that it should purify this limb that's sticking out, not part of the mother's body at all? Amrullah, they said back, Harbe metelas al she'ena gufa yosem gufa. The power of the mother to influence and permit something that's not part of its body is more powerful than what's part of its body. Yosem gufa, more than its body. How do we know that? Because we taught in the Mishnah, if you cut up the baby in its belly, it's no longer attached. All parts of the baby are permitted. But if you cut up part of the spleen or the kidneys, any parts of the mother, they're forbidden to eat. To see that the power of the mother to prevent the baby is stronger than the power of the mother to prevent herself. Because if it's not attached to her, it's part of her, it's not permitted. If it's part of the baby, it is permitted. That is the end of the discussion. So that's the rabbi's last word on the matter. See that the power of the mother's slaughter is effective for even things that are not connected. So just like it's powerful enough for things that are not connected, because what is connected, when it's outside, the shechita is powerful enough to permit it from the tumah, will not be powerful enough to permit it to eat. Now I have a comment on this. Rabbi Shimon, not really on this. We have a comment in general, and we're going to use this as a proof in this discussion eventually. So going back to this, we just mentioned about hanging a limb. Now we're not going to be focused on that for a little while. So Amar Rabbi Shimon Lakish, Reish Lakish says, Machlokas b'uvarim, just like we have a machlokas about a baby, meaning a limb of a baby that got stuck outside before the slaughtering of the mother. Kach machlokas b'uvarim, the same machlokas, the same debate will apply to a limb that is hanging on by a thread. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Machlokas be'aver d'uvar. There's a machlokas about the limb of the baby. But it comes to the limb of an animal that's hanging on by a thread. According to all opinions, shchita osa niful. That slaughtering it makes it as if it fell off, meaning since it was only tenuously attached, then the moment you slaughter it, it's considered to be dead independent of the animal, and it's going to be nevela. This limb is going to be tameh. While the animal's alive, the limb's still attached to it, so the limb won't be tameh. Second, you slaughter the mother, this limb becomes a nevela. And he's saying not only does Rabbi Meir say that, Rabbi Meir who says when the hand is sticking out, that hand is a nevela, saying even the rabbis who say by the hand it's a treifa agree when he slaughtered an animal with a limb hanging on by a thread, that limb is going to be removed from the animal and is going to be a nevela, not a treifa. According to everybody. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina says back, my time at Rabbi Yochanan. What's the reason behind Rabbi Yochanan? Why should I'll leave it to Rabban, according to the rabbis, meaning why should the rabbis treat this limb that hangs on by a thread as more stringent than the hand of the baby? What makes them say that this line does not affect it, even though it does affect the baby? The hand of the baby, can be fixed up by bringing it back. This is Rabbi Yochanan, according to his own opinion. It says if the animal brings the limb back in, you can even eat that limb. We argued on it. Halachas, it doesn't follow Rabbi Yochanan. Halachas says no, even if the animal brings it back in, it's prohibited. Yochanan himself says if the baby brings the limb back in, it's permitted. So you see that this limb is not as severe as the limb that's hanging by a thread. It's hanging by the thread. It is right. There's no way to fix it up. There's no way to bring it back, so to speak. If the limb is hanging by a thread, no way to bring it back, and so it's more permanently forbidden. That's why Rabbi Yochanan says that the limb that got stuck out is a treifa, not going to be tameh. the limb of an animal that's hanging on by a thread is going to be nevela. Mesa, a challenge to one of these means. It's a challenge of Yochanan. Amr lahem Meir. Meir said it's just the same price we just quoted earlier today. Meir said to the rabbis, "Lo, no, your logic's not good. Im tihar tishchita. If you say that slaughtering is a power to purify treifa, an animal that's wounded, osa, but both the treifa itself, ves aver meduldulba, as well as the limb that's hanging on by a thread on the treifa, because it's part of the body. Titahir, will it purify it to uber, the baby, the hand sticking out, davar she'ena gufa is not part of its body. The part we're focusing on is that a mayor, who's one who's stringent, he says that by the baby, the hand is not pure. Nevertheless, says by a limb that's hanging on by a thread, he says it is pure. So how does that fit? So it doesn't sound like neither opinion, right? Both opinions agree that a mayor would say it's aser, would say it's tameh. One says the rabbis agree and say it's tameh, and the other says no, the rabbis say it's not tameh. Rabbi Meir says it is tameh. So this seems to say Rabbi Meir says that it's not tameh. What it says is a question of both. It says Bishlomo la Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So this makes sense according to Reish Lakish, who says that only Rabbi Meir says it's tameh, not the rabbis. So we can explain it. We have an answer to the question. That he's talking to them. He's talking to them in their language. There's no difference between the limb of the fetus. There's no difference between that and the limb of the animal. They're the same. They're both going to be nevela. But he's saying back to them, nevertheless, according to you, I'll agree. I can at least follow your logic when it comes to a limb that's hanging on by a thread, because that's part of the body. I disagree with it, but that much I can at least relate to what you're saying. But you for sure should agree with me about the hand that's not even part of the mother's body. So even though, meaning the problem is, Rabbi Meir said explicitly, slaughtering an animal makes the limb that's hanging on by a thread not a nevela. He said that. So Rabbi Yochanan says everybody agrees that it is a nevela. And Reish Lakish says, Rabbi Meir says it's a nevela. And yet Rabbi Meir himself says it's not a nevela. So how do we reconcile that? So we answered by saying that Reish Lakish can say that Rabbi Meir is talking within the opinion of the rabbis. And the rabbis say both cases, a hanging off limb and the hand of a baby that got stuck out, slaughtering the mother helps for both of them. And Meir says, I hold slaughtering the mother helps, slaughtering the animal, not the mother, but slaughtering the animal, in the case of the limb hanging on by a thread, helps for both. It helps, slaughtering the animal helps for the limb hanging on by a thread, slaughtering the mother helps for the hand of the baby. Right? Meir says, I'm willing to accept begrudgingly that you hold that by the limb hanging on by a thread, slaughtering will help. I disagree. But I can at least stomach that. If you disagree with me on that, I can stomach it. But the hand of the baby that's not even part of the mother's body, that I can't stomach at all. Really, I hold they're both tameh. But if you're going to go so far to say that the limb hanging by a thread is pure, you can't go even further than that and say the baby is pure. That's the way Reish Lakish could explain this brisa of Rabbi Meir talking, that even though Rabbi Meir says it purifies a limb, but Rabbi Meir himself doesn't actually hold to that. And Rabbi Yochanan that says both the Rabbi Meir and the Chamim say this limb is tameh. Kasha, how do you interpret this brisa? Brisa says clearly that the limb that's hanging on by a thread is pure when you slaughter the animal. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, then nobody holds that. Everybody would agree that it's tameh, and yet we have a brisa that Rabbi Meir says it's tahor. So how do we reconcile that? We says, okay, fine, back to the drawing board. Yeah. We made a mistake somewhere. Ella rather he hit more. If Rabbi Yochanan said what he said, how he hit more? This is what I said. What's the machlokas Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan? Amar Rabbi Shimon Lakish. Rabbi Shimon Lakish says, "Kamachlokas b'uvarim." Just like there's machlokas about the fetuses, meaning the hand of the fetus. Machlokas b'uvarim. So too, there's machlokas on the limbs that are hanging on by a thread. Yochanan Omer. Yochanan says no. Machlokas be'ever d'uber. There's machlokas by a limb of a fetus. By ever behema, a limb of an animal. Divrei kol Ein shrita osa nipol. Slaughtering it does not make it as if it fell off. Slaughtering will affect the limb, will permit to remove the tumor from the limb. According to everybody, even Rabbi Meir, who says by the limb of the baby it's tameh, he will agree by the limb of an animal that was slaughtered that the limb hanging on of a thread is pure. That the slaughtering helps there. And then according to Rabbi Yochanan, now you can read this brisa very simply. Rabbi Meir says it permits it and to remove the tumor from it and from the limb hanging on by a thread. He meant it. According to Rish Lakish, it's a little difficult that Rabbi Meir says that the limb is pure and he doesn't actually mean it. He's just talking within the opinion of the rabbi, saying, I can stomach you saying this. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's even simpler. He actually holds it himself. So Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina, Yossi son of Rabbi Chanina says, my time into Rabbi Yochanan leave it to Rabbi Meir. What's the reason of Rabbi Yochanan according to Rabbi Meir? Meaning, why does Rabbi Meir agree by the limb hanging by a thread, even though he argues on the hand of the baby that got stuck out? The reason is, high gufa, this is part of the body, the high love gufa, and it's not part of the body. I mean, the limb that's hanging by a thread is part of the body. Slaughtering makes sense to permit the limb. But the baby that stuck his hand out, that's not part of the body of the mother, and therefore, the slaughtering of the mother doesn't help. That's what Rabbi Meir is saying. Amar Yitzchak bar Yosef. Yitzchak bar Yosef says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the opinion of Yochanan, Hakol modim. Everyone agrees, Shemisa osa nipo. Ve'en shrita osa nipo. That when an animal dies, then the limb that's attached to it by a thread is considered to have fallen off already. It's not part of the animal. But when you slaughter the animal, the limb is part of the animal. Now, what difference does it make if the limb is not part of the animal when the animal dies? Either way, it's unavailable. So I believe there's a second prohibition called Ever Minachai, the limb of a living animal. That if you eat part of a live animal, then that's a separate avera. Besides being available, besides everything else, that's an avera. Not only that, but the tumah of a limb has certain stringencies over the tumah of an animal. And the entire limb is tameh, regardless of how big it is. But most kinds of tumah, there's a minimum size. When it's a whole limb, at least on Ever Minachai, then it's going to be tameh, no matter how big it is. So anyway, he says, Evan agrees when the animal dies on its own, a limb that was not attached to the animal, was barely attached to the animal at that time, is considered to be independent of it. The animal's death was not affected, and it's still considered to be Ever Minachai, still considered to be a limb of a live animal. However, when he slaughtered the animal, everyone agrees the other way, that slaughtering does affect this limb, and that at the very least, the limb is not tameh. So now, the Gemara has a question on this statement. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Oh, sorry, we did that already. Okay. But my asking, what cases they were saying they all agree? If we're talking about the limb of the baby, and that is saying that slaughtering the mother, the Evan agrees that does not make it detached. That's the case they argue about. You can't say that's what it means. When he says everybody agrees that slaughtering does not make it as if it fell off. No, that's not true. They argue in that case. The case of what he says that they agree to is the limb of the animal that's hanging on by a thread. And the Gemara says, Misa, the case of the animal dying, Tanina, we have a brisa that says the animal dies, the limb that's hanging by a thread is tameh. Shchita Tanina. And slaughtering it, we also have a brisa that says the limb hanging by a thread is permitted from tumah by slaughtering it. They're both, we didn't need anyone to tell us this. We have brisas that confirm both opinions. So, Misa Tanina, we taught a case of the animal dying. It says, Mesa habehema, if an animal dies, we're talking about the animal with a limb hanging on by a thread. That animal dies. Habasar sarich heksher. Then the meat requires heksher. Heksher is, in order for food to be tameh, needs to first come into contact with one of the 7 liquids. which are wine, honey, oil, milk, dew, blood, and water. So if the flesh is any food has not come into contact with one of the 7 liquids, that liquid cannot become tamei. The moment that the food comes into contact with one of these 7 liquids is now called muksha or heksher, prepared. And when it's kosher, that the word kosher means prepared. Doesn't really mean prepared to eat. It means it's prepared. It's ready, meaning you're allowed to eat it. It's been prepared for eating. But any food requires touching these 7 liquids. Now, when you slaughter an animal, generally there's blood. So meat in general is considered to be prepared because the blood comes out of the animal and it's going to be prepared because of that blood. So we're saying if an animal with a limb hanging on, habasa tzrik heksher, then the meat requires heksher. The blood of the mother of the animal that you're slaughtering does not affect this limb. It's not considered part of the animal, and for that purpose, if you have flesh hanging off, that's what I'm talking about. If you have flesh hanging off the animal, loose flesh that's hanging on by a thread, that flesh requires heksher. It has to get wet to be tamei. You don't say it can be tamei now. It's not considered attached to the body enough that it's heksher now. For the flesh hanging off is not a limb. It's not going to be tamei. But aver, however, aver metame, shum aver menachai. The limb is tamei is aver menachai. It's going to have a stronger tuma, and therefore it has the status of a limb from a living animal. But it does not have the status of a limb from a nevela. And the difference is, it's actually more lenient in this case, that they're both tamei, but flesh that comes off, the flesh of a nevela is tamei. If a kazayas and nevela, at tamei can make a person tamei. But if you have a limb that fell off while the animal's alive, and then you take that limb is tamei. But if you take flesh off that limb is not going to be tamei. Only the whole limb as a whole entity is tamei. So it says when the animal dies, then if you have flesh hanging off, that flesh is considered food. It needs to get wet to be tamei, but it's considered to be that kind of food. But the limb is considered to be as if it fell off already, and therefore it's the limb of it's not an nevela limb. It's an aver menachai limb, which is forbidden to eat, but will not be tamei. The meat of it, if you take the meat off it, will not be tamei. The limb as a whole entity is tamei, but the meat of the limb that was hanging on by a thread when the animal was slaughtered, that meat is not tamei by itself. If we have animal that dies after being slaughtered, all the meat on it is tamei by itself. The limb that's hanging by a thread, the meat is not tamei itself. It's only tamei as an entire limb, but not if you cut it into pieces. You see what Rabbi Bar Yosef said, that death makes it as if it was detached already. It's not considered to be part of the dead animal. And then it says, that's the Divrei Meir. Then shchita namitin. We also taught that slaughtering an animal does not make the limb considered to be dropped off, and the limb is slaughtered. So today we have a brayso that said that as well. Nishchata behema. If an animal is slaughtered, they meaning both the flesh and the limb are considered prepared in its blood. They do not need to get wet after that. Divrei Meir. According to Rabbi Meir, Shimon says lo ukshiru. They were not prepared. It's not called they got wet. They're not attached enough to say they got wet. It says no. If it had been for that, if it had not been for the statement of Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef in the name of Yochanan that tells us that when an animal dies, it's considered to be detached. Animal is slaughtered. It's not considered detached. If it had only been for these brises, I would have thought my hukshiru. What does it mean they're prepared? A basar. It's only talking about the flesh hanging off, not the limb. There's a problem with that. Hukshiru. It says hukshiru, which is plural. They were prepared. So why does it mean if it's only talking about one thing, in the case of the meat that's hanging by a thread, why does it say they were prepared? It sounds like what's they? The flesh and the limb. So no ma'od tema. What you have thought? Chad lebasar porish min behema. One's talking about meat that's hanging off an animal. The chad lebasar porish min aver. One's talking about the meat that is hanging on from the limb. And really, the limb is not considered attached, but meat hanging from the limb, that when I say they were prepared, it means limb hanging off from a limb after you slaughter it. I mean, one's talking about a limb that's hanging off before you slaughter, one's talking about a limb that's removed after it's slaughtered. My umi to high me high. Why is one better than the other? I mean, why do we need both things to teach us? Why would we distinguish between them and say that maybe the limb that's hanging on is pure, but the limb that's the flesh that's moved later is not pure? Why would you say one's better than the other? Because if they're not better than the other, we don't need two sources for it. If two things are identical, even though they're two different cases, but there's no reason to think one's better than the other, then whichever verse that says Tameh would assume it's the one that's more likely Tameh. The second verse tell you that they're both Tameh. Or Tahar, same thing, Tahar. If the bigger Chiddush is, if you only in one verse, it would assume the smaller Chiddush, not the bigger. So asking what makes one greater than the other, then we need two verses to teach us that they are Tahar. That they are Tameh. That they are considered detached from the animal. So Salkadaita, I mean, I would have thought to say, that the case of the limb that's attached is Tameh, the more strict Tameh when it's part of the father, when it's part of the animal that you slaughtered, as it's Tameh's Nevela, which is more strict than Tumah food. Nevela is going to be an Ava Tumah, the father category of Tumah. And not only is it the father category, they'll make a person and the clothing they're wearing Tameh. And it also makes a person Tameh by carrying it. That's called Tumah Chamura. So since it has a Tumah when it's attached to the father, that's why it's strict. It does not need to get wet. Ema, I would say low boy heksher. That's why it does not need to get wet. Come on, but when it's part of the body, then it's Tameh. That's why we say it does need to get wet. But this limb that's almost detached is not part of the body, and therefore you might think that the flesh of that animal needs heksher, needs to be prepared. That's why I taught us that the flesh needs to be prepared. So Amar Rav Yosef. Yosef says, Naki to Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef biyadecha. Take the statement of Yitzchak bar Yosef, who says that Evan agrees that death makes it detached, and Evan agrees that slaughtering it makes it not detached. That one you can rely on. In the other opinions, that you can rely on. Why? The Rabbi Bar Chana koikavasek, because Rabbi Bar Chana says the same as what he says. Tanya, it says in the Brisa, Basar trefa, an animal that's torn in the field, lo tachelu, do not eat it. What is it going to teach us? What says don't eat it? To bring to add on that category, the flesh and a limb that's hanging on an animal and a bird. And an animal, designated wild animal and a bird. V'shaktin, you slaughter them, to say that they are forbidden to eat. That's a brisa. The Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Bar Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ein men el mitzvahs perush kovad. No, they're not, even though they're asked to eat, but the level of this prohibition is a mitzvah to separate, meaning it's a rabbinic prohibition. They're not talking forbidden on a Torah level, talking forbidden on a rabbinic level. So why does it say, what do we see from that? In fact, Rabbi Bar Chana and Rabbi Yochanan says it's only rabbinic. That teaches us that that slaughtering it does not make it detached. On a Torah level, slaughtering it does not make it detached. It's still considered part of the mother when you slaughter it. Only rabbinically, it's going to be forbidden to eat. But in terms of the basic halachas, slaughtering the animal does make them considered to be slaughtered. Yosef Rav Yosef Kamed Rav Huna. Yosef sat in front of Rav Huna. Yosef Akamar, he sat and he said, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. Yehuda says the name of Rav. Achlu zeh loke. Someone eats this, you get lashes. So you see, you can't say it's derabanan. You get lashes for it. Amalei Ahu Merabanan. One of the rabbis said to him, Lo tzitzulei, don't listen to Yosef. Achi Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta. Take the son of Shmuel, son of Marta, said Mishmei Rav, in the name of Rav. Achlu zeh eino loke. If you eat it, you don't get lashes. Now, Amar le Rav Huna. Rav Huna says back, Ana naman nismach. Who is supposed to rely on? We have this argument. Who to rely on? Adrin of Yosef Ape. Yosef turned his face around. Amar le says, my kushya. What's your question? I mean, you think we're arguing? You think that I said that you get lashes, and he said you don't get lashes. You think we're arguing? We're not arguing. When I say what I said, but me, so time an animal died, it's to me some nipple that when the animal dies and makes the limb fall off, that's how I get lashes for eating it. Kamar Ihu, but it's talking about he says that does not make the limb fall off. Bishchita, that's talking about slaughtering it. The ainos and evil. It's slaughtering the animal does not make it as if it fell off. And the slaughtering of the animal will affect the limb, and the limb is going to be slaughtered as well. Amar Rava. Rava says, Mina Hamil Sadamar Banan. From what is the source for this statement that the rabbi said, means the osanipol, that slaughtering the animal makes it as if the limb fell off. Shchita ain't osanipol, but when you shech an animal, that does not make it as if the limb fell off. Slaughtering will affect his limb that's hanging on by a thread. But when the animal dies, the limb is going to be separate from the animal, even though it's still hanging on by a thread. The verse says, Chol asher yipol alav mehem b'mosam yitma. Anything, any liquid that it falls on them in their death will be tameh. It says on them. Whenever it says on something like from them or on them, that's an exclusion. Only on them. So what's being excluded here? What case is being excluded from this verse? It says in their death it's tameh. Means in their life it's not tameh. I mean, that's what the verse is teaching us. Nafka. That we learn from the person says their carcasses. Their carcasses are tameh. So clearly when it's alive it's not tameh. So only the verse to tell us that in their death it's tameh, but not in their life. So what do we learn after the phrase in its death is tameh? It's not like its death, it is tahor. So Nevela Sanaf, we learn out from the word Nevela. El Shema Mina. Now that from here we hear Misa Osa Nipol, then the animal dying makes nipol, it's going to be separate from the animal, in Shkita Osa Nipol. And slaughtering does not make it fall off. It says anyone touches them in their death. When they die naturally, that's when it's tameh. When it doesn't die naturally, it was slaughtered, though the limb is only hanging on by a thread, nevertheless, slaughtering will purify it, it will not be forbidden. Amar le Rav Ada bar Ava l'Rava. Rav Ada bar Ava says, Rav, hold on a second. Hak Rabbi Shratzim ksiv. This verse is not talking about an animal that requires slaughtering. This animal is talking about the 8 species of crawly small animals that are tameh as the sherets. And this verse is talking about the sherets. Anyone touches the sherets in it while it's dead. How can you say it's seen as something about the laws of slaughtering? There's no slaughtering by a sherets. It's not relevant there. I says, right, exactly, it's not relevant there. Amar Le says back to him, Eino in l'shratz, it's not relevant when it comes to sherets because there's no slaughtering of sherets. Lav mishchita, there's no slaughtering them. Tanu in l'behema, let us apply it to an animal. Say that an animal that was slaughtered, an animal that when it's in its death, then it is tameh. But when it was slaughtered, it's not death, that will not make it tameh. Vakatin boile, you still need this verse. Kain misa, what does it mean in their death? It has to be similar to the state of death. Lachim atamin, it's only time when it's moist. Kivation, when it's completely dried out, desiccated, ain matamin does not make it tameh. So we need a verse that says bimosam in its death, because it has to be as like it looks when in normal case when it dies. As if it died in natural cause, it has to be intact. But if it's not intact, then the truma does not travel. And if it was not intact, not intact, that's not tummy at all. So if it's dried out, then the sheretz is not tummy. That's what we learn in their death. Meaning, if it's like the moment of a death, then it's tummy. If it's not like the moment of death, it is not tummy. So we need the word b'mosam teaches that halacha. How can you use the word b'mosam teaches the other halacha that if the animal dies, then it's tummy, the animal is slaughtered, it's not tummy. The trey b'mosam ksivi, it says the word b'mosam twice. It has to be similar to the point of death. It has to be intact for it to be tummy. Amar Rav Chisrim, it says machlokas be'ever deubar chai. There's a machlokas about the limb of the animal when it's alive. We slaughter the mother when the baby's alive. Ever deubar mace, but the limb of the animal of the mother is dead. Evan agrees that slaughtering makes the limb fall off, and it's going to be tummy. Rabbi Yehuda says, just like there's malchus in one case, there's malchus in the other, whether it's animals alive, animals dead, then slaughtering it, they're gonna have this machlokus, does slaughtering remove it or not? Okay. Guess I'll keep going. Ben Shmona Chai. You have an 8-month baby that was living. We mentioned in passing that animal slaughtering it does not purify it from being nevela, because no 8-month baby has slaughtering. The 8-month baby can never be slaughtered. Slaughtering does not help it. Therefore, if you do permit it to eat, since the slaughtering cannot permit it to eat no matter what, then slaughtering would also not remove the tumah from it. Vatanya, but it says in the Brayse, Ben Shmona Chai Yochiach, we have the opposite. The 8-month baby will prove, even though you have in its general species slaughtering, still slow slaughtering the baby does not purify it. Amar Rav Kana says, it can be slaughtered by its inside its mother. Tanidan, that's what that Brayse is saying. Tanidan, in our Brayse, meaning would not ask a question from being part of the mother. That says too far removed. We hold that's not a question. Well, hi Tana de Parich, according to the Tana that asked the question, about a treifa shechizah matarasa, the treifa that slaughtering it purifies it. Minale, sorry, I said it wrong. According to this Tana, that undermines the proof. I mean, our Tana ends the Mishnah off and says that a treifa, that a 8-month baby that was slaughtered is not a kasha, because there's no such thing as an 8-month baby that was slaughtered. But the Brayse says no, an 8-month baby could be slaughtered. It could be slaughtered as part of its mother. So he holds that discussion does not come to a resolution. So you don't have a source for this halacha that slaughtering the mother affects the baby. So treifa, in general case of a treifa, an animal that's wounded, that's slaughtered. Sorry, it's a general case where the animal is slaughtered, but it's found to be sick. How do you know that's not tummy? We don't have a source for that. According to this opinion, but we derived it from the fact that the baby, you needed the baby to be to not having to be completely excluded from the category of slaughtering for us to say this is valid. But if the baby is not included entirely in this category of slaughtering, then our proof is invalid, and we don't know. We don't know that slaughtering an animal removes the tumah of the nevela from it. So how do we know that according to this opinion? How do you know that slaughtering it purifies it? Not Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. He learns out from the statement of Yehuda Amarav. Rabbi Yehuda Amarav, because Yehuda said the name of Rav. I mean, there's reason time. Some say it's in a brisa. The verse says, when it will die from the animal. What does that mean? Mixes behema matama. Some animals are tame. Some animals are not tame, even though they're dead. The ezezo, and what's the difference? What's the difference between an animal that's dead as tame and an animal that's not tame? Because there's mina behema from the animals. A selection of animals are tame. How do you distinguish between the ones that are tame and not? This is a wounded animal that you slaughtered it. That is the animal that is not tame. Okay, why don't we stop here?
The
Yeah. You know when Rabbi Yehuda comes back?
Sorry?
Do you know when Rabbi Yehuda gets back?
My wife thought it was the 17th. I don't know.
Okay.
Other than her input.
We'll be back for Shabbos Chazon, but I don't